Good evening. I'm very pleased to be able to welcome everyone to this evening's ISAC lecture, the next in our series this fall related to the exhibition. And hopefully, I know I saw some of you in the tour that Ryan was giving before the lecture this evening, but we obviously, if you haven't had a chance to see it yet, there's still plenty of opportunity to do so. I'm also very pleased to be able to introduce our speaker this evening, and I just confirmed with her that this is her first official or formal lecture in Breasted Hall. So I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to be the one to introduce her to our ISAC community. And I'm speaking here of Professor Jana Matuszak, who is since January of this year, she hasn't even been here quite a full year, Professor of Assyriology. Give you a little bit of background on her academic history, and she began as a student in Germany and finished through her BA and MA into her PhD at Tübingen University, where she completed a dissertation. And I'll just read the English part so that we don't take too long here. You are a woman? Studies in Sumerian literary disputations between women, with the principal edition of the text To Women Be. And this is something I think we're going to hear a little bit more about this evening. She received 2 distinguished awards for this. First, the prize for the international prize for the dissertation of the year in the International Association for Assyriology, as well as the German Academic Scholarship Foundation's top dissertation in the Humanities and Social Sciences in 2019. So this very important piece of scholarship, she was then able to further develop into a book that came out in 2021. And it gives a good sense of the kind of scholarship that Jana has focuses on, which is her particular interest in lesser known or hitherto unstudied texts. I would even say further, particularly difficult texts, often dealing with humor or satire, and I think we're going to get a sense of some of that from her lecture this evening. Her work combines philological basic research with analytical methods derived from both literary and cultural studies. In addition to her dissertation, Jana has also begun working on a number of other monograph projects. Most importantly, I'd like to emphasize one, Defining Femininity, the construction of ideal women in Sumerian didactic literature at the dawn of the 2nd millennium BCE. And she is also working with Pascal Attinger on a short grammar of Sumerian in the Old Babylonian period. She has also, in addition to these monograph-length projects, she has quite an impressive list of articles forthcoming or in print. Just to give you a flavor of the titles of some of these, again, I think will help to highlight the focus of her scholarship. They include, I think, as I was saying to her, these are particularly intriguing. A Woman's Place is in the House. Perspectives on Women's Mobility from Sumerian Literature. Another, Humor in Sumerian Didactic Literature. A Complete Reconstruction, a new edition and interpretation of the Sumerian morality tale, The Old Man and the Young Girl. Another, She Was Dumbstruck and It Took Her to Heart, Form and Function of Insults in Sumerian Literary Disputations Between Women. Another is Assessing Misogyny in Sumerian Disputations and Diatribes. And one last one here, She Is Not Fit for Womanhood, the Ideal Housewife, according to Sumerian literary texts. Jana also has other active scholarship that she's involved in, including co-editing the journal Altorientische Forschungen, published to De Gruyter. And lastly, just to shift to her talk this evening, you have the title in front of you there. Ancient Iraq is famous for producing the world's earliest computations of caustic law, the Laws of Hammurabi being the most renowned example. But what happens when a legal problem occurs that has not been considered by royal legislation? Law and Morality in Sumerian Satirical Tales. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jana Matuszak and her lecture this evening.
Thank you very much, Tim, for this, for the invitation to speak here. It's a great honor to be speaking in Breasted Hall. B, for the very generous introduction. I hope I'll live up to this. And thank you all for coming in such great numbers. I feel usually in the winter months, I have to congratulate you for coming here in one piece. There's always one comment at the start of these ISAC lectures that comments on the bad Chicago weather. Can't really do that today, so I'll have to break with that time-honored tradition. In modern legal and colloquial discourse, law and morality are usually seen as two distinct yet related regulators of social conduct. While laws are detailed and specific and can be enforced by the state, morality operates according to broad ethical concepts, and the more subtle and variable consequences of behavior that is considered immoral can be implemented by practically anyone. Moreover, whereas law seems fixed, individual laws can be changed much faster than generally accepted moral values, which are usually inculcated from childhood. Ideally, both law and morality should be governed by a sense of justice. But while law and morality often do converge, they don't always overlap. What is legal may by some be considered immoral, and what some consider moral may in fact be illegal. Applying these concepts to an ancient society such as the Babylonian is hampered by several different factors, such as the fact that there was no binding canonical law in the modern sense that can be thereby enforced, and that the texts from legal practice are usually too bare bones to allow us to assess the ratio of legal and moral considerations that went into the resolution of the problem at hand. Moreover, and this will be important for what follows, the king as divinely appointed guardian of justice seems to embody and guarantee both law and moral principles. In my lecture today, I will focus on two rather neglected Sumerian satirical tales from the Old Babylonian period, so that's from the first half of the second millennium BCE, which seem to illustrate the interplay between law and morality. Unlike other compositions that feature in this lecture series accompanying the wonderful special exhibition Back to School in Babylonia, the two stories that I'll be talking about were apparently not integral to scribal education during the Old Babylonian period. They each exist in only a few, often badly preserved manuscripts. After reconstructing the plots and outlining my interpretation of the story's meaning and function, I will end my presentation by shifting the focus on the material properties of the extant manuscripts, which, despite their limited number, still suggests that the stories played a role in different contexts, both intermediate and advanced scribal education, and even scholarship. The two stories, known by their modern titles as Three Ox Drivers from Adab and Old Man and Young Girl, seem to form a pair. They share the general structure, key characters and motives, and even entire phrases. Both stories feature nameless, paradigmatic representatives of different social groups determined by age, gender, profession, and other status indicators. And, as we will see, both stories are satirical because they focus on exposing the flaws associated with these types in a humorous, entertaining, and instructive way. As we'll see in due course, business partners are uncooperative, old men lecherous, and young girls treacherous. The implicit moral lessons is hence not to behave like these fools, for every one of them will get punished as befits them. But that is not all. The stories derive their particular ingenuity from the fact that within the context of a cautionary tale, they construct a ludicrous legal problem, which cannot easily be solved by the law, whatever that is. They thus illustrate the limits of legal discourse and law collections in particular, which bears considerable subversive potential since, according to royal ideology, laws were formulated by the king at the behest of the gods. So they're perfect. To be clear, in the following discussion, I do not wish to suggest that royal law collections had normative status. It has long been demonstrated, particularly with respect to the Laws of Hammurabi, that this is an immensely complex monument to royal patronage of law, comprising elements of legal systematization, suggestions for an ideal society, royal propaganda, scholastic literature, and more, but that it was never used as a day-to-day legal reference work. It also needs to be stated that there is no indication that these casuistic compilations were ever intended to be complete or all-encompassing. Still, for understanding the two stories discussed in the following, it seems useful to emphasize that it was Old Babylonian scribes who copied stela inscriptions containing the promulgations of kings from Ur-Namma to Hammurabi in excerpts or their entirety. This made scribes the premier preservers and connoisseurs of this textual genre, and royal law collections treated as a text could hence be subjected to commentary, parody, and other scribal practices. I have a feeling that the copying of the law collections likely also made scribes susceptible to noticing apparent gaps or gray zones of semi-legal nature that the compilations either incidentally or conceptually did not cover. As I hope to show, 3 ox drivers from Adab and Old Man and Young Girl engage in thought experiments informed by contemporaneous legal discourse and hence indirectly bear witness to scribal endeavors at the intersection of legal thought and literature. While the stories never refer to any legal corpora directly, a full appreciation of their originality was only possible for those who were familiar with Mesopotamian legal law as it was studied during scribal education. And yeah, it apparently wasn't central to the curriculum, but a few apprentices demonstrably encountered these texts during their education. Let's look at the first example. In the first story, 3 carters hailing from the city of Adab are on a mission. One man has an ox or a bull, the Sumerian word is conveniently ambiguous, the other a cow, and the third man has a wagon. Now, what may sound like a completely innocuous setup to modern readers not too familiar with the business of driving carts would have probably aroused the first round of laughter among ancient Babylonians. Nobody in their right mind, least of all professional carters, would ever set out on a business trip like this. What is the cow doing here? She is not commonly used as a draft animal. And given the matching pair of male and female bovines, one wonders, has the bull really been castrated? And why is it important to inform readers that the 3 men are from Adab? With these questions raised but not answers, the story continues. And indeed, our suspicion that their mission was probably doomed right from the start is soon confirmed, for apparently the 3 colleagues were also foolish enough to forget to bring provisions, and they become plagued with thirst. However, every one of them refuses to go and fetch water, because the owner of the ox/bull fears that in his absence he may be devoured by a lion. The owner of the cow worries that if he leaves her, she may wander off into the desert. And the owner of the wagon is anxious that his cargo may get stolen. So, foolish and mistrustful as they are, they decide to go together and leave all of their prized possession behind. The minute they're gone, fantastic events happen in rapid succession. The ox/bull impregnates the cow immediately gives birth to a calf, and the calf apparently eats or otherwise destroys the cargo. Our initial concerns were thus justified. Either a castrated draft ox managed to impregnate a cow, making the conception of the incredibly fast-growing calf even more miraculous, or the 3 carters set out with a pair of animals completely unfit for purpose, a cow, and, crazier still, a horny bull, whom one would have a very hard time persuading to pull a cart in the first place. The ambiguity of Sumerian good, which can mean both ox and bull, is thus fully and, in my mind, very successfully exploited for storytelling purposes, while the carter's origin from Adab now finds its explanation in the fact that Adab is the home of the mother goddess and her entourage, who are all concerned with all aspects of births, regular or bizarre. When the 3 colleagues have quenched their thirst and return to the desert, they face complicated issues of property and liability law. Foremost on their minds is the question, who owns the calf? But implied in the question of rightful ownership is also the question, Who assumes responsibility for the calf consuming the cargo? Although their discussion is not quoted within the text and only alluded to as part of the narrative, we can speculate that the owner of the wagon might have wanted to claim the calf as compensation for the loss of his cargo, at probably the mouth of the calf. The owner of the ox/bull might have insisted that the calf is his as some sort of stud fee, and the owner of the cow might have claimed the calf either because babies normally belong to the owner of the female breeding animal or as compensation for unplanned or wrongful insemination. Be that as it may, the three colleagues cannot resolve the matter amongst themselves and approach the king as a supreme judge. He listens to their story, but, unheard of in the world of kings of supreme knowledge and wisdom, he doesn't know what to do and consults a court lady instead, possibly a double joke with sexist overtones. As king and divinely appointed supreme judge and lawgiver of his country, he should be the ultimate authority on all legal problems, no matter how difficult. And if he indeed must solicit legal advice from anyone, one would expect him to consult the assembly of male experts that often features in Sumerian model court cases, and not one of his completely untrained court ladies, at least in the legal sense. The protracted solution to the problem, which involves complex analogies, is unfortunately very badly preserved and difficult to comprehend in its details. Presently, as you can tell from the best preserved manuscript, there is a gap of over 40 lines, which is nearly half of the story. And several of the preserved lines, specifically in this passage up here on the reverse, are fragmentary, so many questions remain, and the following interpretation is highly tentative and provisional at best. But judging from what we can glean from the broken passages, it looks like none of the three carters wins, and everybody loses. Somehow, the ox/bull is linked to its owner's field, and it seems like the potential threat of it being eaten by a lion ultimately, in ways I cannot tell, leads to the field being flooded. If that interpretation is correct, then there is obvious irony in losing one's livelihood to an abundance of water, given that the initial problem was thirst. The fates of his two colleagues seem to rest on similar premises. The owner of the cow ends up divorcing his wife, whom he despises, presumably because she may wander off just like his cow, which would also make her vulnerable to sexual predators, and the man with the wagon apparently not only loses his cargo, but all of his possessions. None of them seems to get the calf. In other words, the three colleagues end up losing pretty much everything they own. On a moral level, this may seem fair. They were each willing to give up their most prized possessions rather than to trust and cooperate, so they also deserve to lose everything, including the bonus calf. But there's also a juridical perspective to this. Martha Roth has shown that legal provisions around rented oxen, which combine property and liability law, were particularly popular in scribal education. Readers of our story would therefore know that if a man rents an ox or a donkey, and a lion kills it in the open country, it is the owner's loss. The fate of the owner of the loaded wagon, on the other hand, recalls another paragraph from the Laws of Hammurabi, which ostensibly is about boats, but that's just another kind of vehicle here. If a man hires a boatman and a boat and loads it with grain, wool, oil, dates, and anything else, and now it comes, that boatman is negligent and thereby causes the boat to sink or its cargo to become lost, the boatman shall replace the boat which he sank and any of its cargo which he lost. Means it was the man of the wagon's fault that he lost his things, and he'll even have to replace it. While these regulations possibly justify their losses, there are no provisions that settle the question at hand, namely, who owns an accidentally begotten calf, born to bovine parents belonging to different owners, and who is liable for damage caused by a calf that doesn't even have an undisputed legal owner yet. As, again, Martha Roth astutely pointed out to me, ownership and liability in an ordinary situation would be clear. Animal babies belong to the owner of the female, just like a slave woman's children belong to her master. This would make the calf the property of the owner of the cow, and he would be responsible for the damage caused by it. But in our story, there are some complicating factors, which each of the three colleagues tries to use to their advantage. Unlike with other randomly conceived animals, such as street dog puppies, the father of the calf is known. The impregnation of the domestic cow was not planned by the owners of cow and ox/bull, and the calf caused damage to a third person's property before anyone knew of its existence. In other words, we seem to have a legal problem which is not easily resolved by applying existing legal provisions, and it is, in my interpretation, this very absence of applicable laws that allows for the entire text to assume the form of a parodied trial presided over by the king. The solution, however, is only partly based on an evaluation of property and liability regulations. More weight is given to an implicit assessment of the businessmen's character flaws, which provide the real reason for why their losses seem justified and nobody deserves the calf. By shifting the focus away from the legal problem and towards the problematic characters, the apparent gap in royal legislation, if you can call it thus, vanishes from view. Personal moral choices also dominate the second story, which is about half as long as Three Ox Drivers from Adab, but luckily almost completely preserved. There, an old man is lusting inappropriately after a young girl and makes her a marriage proposal of sorts without following the customary practice. The young girl accepts, although she is aware of the impotence of the infatuated old man. As with the ill-fated business trip of the Three Ox Drivers, readers are thus warned right at the beginning that this marriage will probably not end well. And indeed, after a while, feigning innocence, the young girl approaches the king, complaining about the fruitless marriage and blaming it on her husband. Again, the king is out of his depth and consults a court lady. In her somewhat oracular answer, she implies that a union between old man and young girl will not miraculously balance out the age difference, so in her opinion, the marriage does seem to be doomed. The king thereupon summons the old man to court and interrogates him about why he cannot perform in bed. Slightly awkward situation. The old man replies with an iconic speech, replete with dense figurative language, asserting that he was once young and virile, but old age has diminished his prowess. A young man used to be my god, strength my protective deity. But now my youth has rushed past my thighs like a fleeing donkey. My formerly black mountain has sprouted white gypsum. My mother has sent a messenger from the forest to me. She's given me a helping hand. My mongoose, which used to eat pungent things, does not even stretch its neck to the jar with clarified butter anymore. It's really beautiful. This testimony, which in veiled terms corroborates the young girl's charges, inspires the king to come up with the surprising idea that the young girl could have sex with her slave and conceive progeny that way. The young girl is delighted, leaves the palace jubilantly, proclaims a general debt remission, which would free debt slaves such as the one intended to become the father of her children, and encourages all young girls to dance around frivolously. The king, in horror, finally realizes her perverted nature, as well as his own mistake in seriously considering her disingenuous plea, annuls her marriage with the old man, and chases her out into the street, where it is insinuated she belongs. Again, the little story implicitly addresses an apparent gap or bias in royal law collections, this time in marriage law. The legal provisions only ever deal with the scenario of an infertile wife, in which case they allow the husband to take a second wife, often a household slave, in order to secure offspring. The second wife would then cease to be his slave. This is illustrated not only by the Laws of Hammurabi, but also by several Old Babylonian contracts in which a second wife is either adopted or purchased. They explicitly record wife number 2, and there they would insert a regular personal name, is slave to wife number 1, but a wife to the husband, and therefore the heirs that they're producing are legitimate. In our story, everything's turned on its head. It's clearly the husband who is impotent, so the king suggests the wife take a second husband, apparently oblivious to the fact that this would be adultery, a capital offense. Moreover, unlike in the scenario of man securing an heir thanks to a second wife, a child conceived of wife and slave would result in the legal paternity of the slave, not the wife's first husband. The proposed solution, hence, does not solve the problem. In fact, the problem cannot be solved by simple analogous inversion unless one is ready to accept the total inversion of the patriarchic order. It's therefore almost a stroke of luck that the young girl interprets the ill-advised one-time solution on a global scale, or one could say, interprets her case as a precedent. Her announcing the release of all debt slaves and license for promiscuity for all girls forces the king to come to his senses just in time to prevent a total upheaval of the social order. While the story presents the dissolution of the ill-fated, ill-fitting marriage as a happy end, I doubt that educated readers would have missed the fact that the king was forced to change his own judgment. According to the laws of Hammurabi, at least, this would have barred him, the supreme legal authority in his country, from ever sitting among the judges again. Here you have this is paragraph 5, not 237, but it reads in abridged form that if a judge renders judgment after which he reverses his judgment, they shall charge and convict him, and they shall unseat him from his judgeship in the assembly, and he shall never sit in judgment with the judges ever again. Does the fact that the king's retraction serves the common good make him exempt from his own rule? By asking, what if it were the other way around, but kind of engaging in this thought experiment, what if things were the other way around? The story exposes the bias inherent in the rule that only men are allowed to have more than one sexual partner while married, and thus briefly shake the very foundation of old Babylonian society. But it's very quick to backtrack and immediately proceeds to justify the existence of the apparent gap and thereby justifies the existing order. This justification is again based on the character flaws of the protagonists. A marriage between a fertile wife and an impotent husband is presented as unthinkable and unnatural because it is the result of bad decisions made by immoral people. The old man should have never proposed to the young girl, and the young girl should have never accepted the proposal. In other words, the story, in legal terms, provides an argumentum ad absurdum. That also explains why, despite cutting such a hapless figure at the beginning and proposing a shocking solution that rounds counter everything he stands for and which he must take back almost immediately, the king, as lawgiver and guardian of social order, ultimately doesn't suffer significant status loss. The laws that he or his predecessors proclaimed at the behest of the gods remain valid and beyond critique, and thanks to his dissolution of the marriage that was never supposed to be, the divinely ordained social order remains intact. The satire hence ultimately criticizes cliched characters, but not institutions, resulting in an exciting tension between explosive ideas and tame solutions, inspired by a cast of socially deviant fools. In both stories, people of questionable character approach the king with seemingly trifling matters, potency issues, and an extra calf. This can be seen as part of the parody, as the king normally only got involved in capital crimes. However, it also serves as a potent illustration of the fact that in both cases, the situation at hand is not covered by royal law collections. According to the implicit logic of the stories, the cases hence must be resolved by the king. But, and here we're back to the satire, the ruling king in the stories does not know how to handle the unusual situation and turns to a court lady for advice. In other words, the person who embodies the institution of royal justice defers a scenario not considered in his law collection to someone outside of the legal system. It's not entirely clear to me how to interpret this. While, at least in the case of the young girl, the king should have never taken her absurd appeal seriously, it is also possible that he wasn't quite so stupid and realized that these problems are somewhat at the intersection of law and morality, and hence cannot be settled by applying legal provisions alone, and that this inspired him to consult someone other than male legal experts. So, should we recognize the court lady as a moral authority, or is it all a joke? While many questions remain, three aspects distinguish these stories from other texts, other Sumerian texts, that I would also locate somewhere between legal case and moralizing fiction. Firstly, by inventing absurd cases, they engage in thought experiments, asking questions that the law collections, which scribal apprentices, as we've seen in the beginning, demonstrably studied and copied during the Old Babylonian period, could not answer. Who is the rightful owner of a calf that was never meant to be born, and who is liable for the damage caused by it? How does a married couple secure progeny if the husband is impotent? These perceived gaps in written legal discourse apparently warranted discussion and commentary, risky as that may be. But the subversive potential was immediately contained by connecting the legal problem to immoral and foolish characters, thereby invalidating it. As a result, the institution of royal justice, which is first called into question, emerges stronger than before. On the level of the narrative, this is expressed by the king regaining control and sentencing each according to their faults. The fact that the stories lack a hero is a second distinguishing factor. In our stories, all parties are guilty in some capacity, and all get punished accordingly, whether by royal decree or not. The possessive ox drivers forfeit their belongings, the lewd old man must forsake his pretty young wife, and the conniving young girl loses her marital status and her home. None of the contestants wins the case, but society as a whole benefits from their conviction. The questionable character of the protagonists explains the third characteristic, namely the fact that the legal problems are never actually really solved, but simply undone. Old Man and Young Girl does not provide a viable solution to how an old husband and a young wife can produce children. A marriage between a fertile wife and an impotent husband is presented as so absurd that it should be prevented at all costs, or at best be dissolved, because it cannot be remedied within the existing norms that prohibit a married woman from sleeping with someone other than her husband. Something similar can be observed with respect to the three ox drivers from Adab, which seems to presage a satirical take on Solomonic wisdom. Unlike in the biblical story, in which Solomon determines the baby's real mother by means of a test, our king decides that because of their moral shortcomings and their professional incompetence, none of the three colleagues deserved the extra calf. But he does not stop there. At least if my reconstruction so far is correct, it could be disproved in the future. But as it stands, it looks like by ensuring that all three of them lose pretty much everything, he deprives them of the material basis for carrying out their former profession, at which they so obviously failed, and thereby prevents them from making similar mistakes at the future. This pairing of professional incompetence and immoral behavior is also found in Sumerian disputations and advice literature, such as the instructions of Shurupak. Our story's connection with proverbs, instructional texts, disputations, character portraits, and other texts commonly termed wisdom literature is further underscored by a shared preference for presenting negative examples as a deterrent. This is a popular strategy across Sumerian moralizing and didactic texts. The cast of foolish characters, each of whom deserves to lose, distinguishes our stories from text used in the legal training of scribes, such as model court cases and the final third of the literary disputation To Women Be, all of which contrast an innocent plaintiff and a guilty defendant. While To Women Be follows the trials of a wrongfully accused heroine fighting her way to justice, the model court cases tend to focus on the defendant, who is rightfully convicted. But even in their focus on the perpetrator, there's always a victorious party present or implied. The didactic benefits in all these texts lies in learning how justice is achieved by following the appropriate procedures. They thus elucidate the workings of legal practice, and I think this is important, instill trust in the legal system in exactly those scribal apprentices who would later be expected to uphold it as part of their professional career. Our stories approach the topic from a different angle, but at least the better preserved old man and young girl equally ends up proving the validity of marriage law as it stands. Sorry, that's the slide you're supposed to see. So let us briefly consider the role of stories that our stories may have played in scribal circles. In 3 ox drivers from Adab, the distinctly scribal scholarly context is literally written into the last line of the story, which records the following. Paningnara, their eldest brother, the scholar, the god of Adab, was the court case's scribe. On the one hand, the choice of divine patron alludes once more to the miraculously fast gestation, birth, and growth of the calf. The god Paningnara was associated with the mother goddess residing in Adab, and he was responsible for fetuses as well as premature and stillborn, or apparently incredibly fast-born calves. His qualifications as a scholar and scribe, however, root him and the entire composition in an academic milieu. The title scribe also establishes a link between the alleged divine notary and subsequent generations of scribal apprentices copying this text as part of their training. Kishti Ea, for instance, who copied the text in late Old Babylonian Sippar in the 8th regnal year of the Babylonian king Amitsaduqa, Kishti Ea referred to himself as an apprentice scribe, Dubsatur, at the time of writing. As shown by Franz von Koppen, Kishti Ea went on to work as a professional scribe and wrote several perfectly normal, humorless contracts for his fellow Sippar citizens. According to his titles, however, he was proud of his education. 3 years after he copied our story, he proceeds to call himself Dubsar, so no more apprentice scribes. He's a real scribe now. And another 2 years later, he calls himself Dumu Iduba'a, son of the scribal school, referring specifically to the kind of academic literary education that he would have enjoyed. In the case of Old Man and Young Girl, no colophons mentioning the names of scribes are preserved. But we can observe that passages of particular literary value, such as the old man's iconic speech for the defense, have been excerpted in several so-called proverb collections, indicating an ancient appreciation for idiosyncratic and creative use of language. As has been compellingly argued by Yoram Cohen, the so-called proverb collections, which quote some of the passages from our text, did not just play a role in scribal training, but also attest to compilation efforts, which served various purposes in the quest for achieving scholarly erudition. And indeed, evidence for junior scribes studying our stories in the intermediate stages of scribal education exists in the form of lenticular tablets containing single-line excerpts such as these 2 from Nippur, where the one on the left records the statement of the cow owner saying that he will never abandon her because she might run away, and the one on the right records the old man's wedding proposal of sorts. I want to store my old straw in your new storehouse. Which is, again, highly metaphoric and really just talks about his wish to have sex with the young girl. But you can see from the contrasting and unexpected use of old and new that he's going against established practice and that this won't work. You don't store old grain in new storehouse. It should be the other way around. You have one storehouse and you keep storing fresh straw. The first line of Old Man and Young Girl is also attested as a catch line on teacher-student exercises, a reference I owe to Jeremiah Peterson. And both these tablet types, lentils and teacher-student exercises, are characteristic of a student's first foray into literary territory. However, as we've already seen, both stories are also attested on large tablets written by advanced scribe. 3 Ox Drivers from Adab is known from 2 manuscripts that originally contained the entire composition and nothing else. Both of them bear marks on the margins after 10 or 20 lines, And the one written by Kishti Ea on the left also details that the tablet is complete at 95 lines, a precise statement that safely anchors the story in the written scribal tradition. The bottom of the other tablet, where one might expect a colophon, is unfortunately lost. For Old Man and Young Girl, the line count of the individual manuscript differs, but since it's about half as long as Three Ox Drivers from Adab, it is exclusively attested on big compilation tablets, even if some of them are only surviving in very small fragments. But all of these tablets would have originally collected miscellaneous prose miniatures, which are usually subsumed under the heading Wisdom Literature. Yoram Cohen has convincingly argued that these compilations of seemingly disparate texts show that they were recognized as a specific, valuable, and important type of literature, which was cultivated in order to meet curricular, intellectual, and academic purposes, and that these texts were not only studied for moral education, but also for achieving, scribal education. While we have currently no evidence for our stories being used for exegetical and hermeneutic purposes, as Cohen has shown for the later compilation of Akkadian wisdom texts called the Series of Sidhu, I would argue that the extensive analogies in Three Ox Drivers from Adab, linking oxen to fields and cows to wives, the shrewd commentary on extant and non-extant legal provisions in both stories, as well as the word, sound, and sign play, which I didn't talk about today very much. All of these things can be seen as manifestations of early Babylonian hermeneutics at play, which firmly situates our stories in scribal circles. In conclusion, we've seen that both stories bear a strong legal underpinning, which establishes links with other genres of academic legal discourse, such as law collections and model court cases, while the condemnation of fools resembles messages found in wisdom literature. Whereas the moral lesson would have probably been fairly obvious to anyone, the story's juridical depth could only be appreciated by those who were familiar with legal tradition as it was studied at school. This may also be reflected in the different manuscript types, which were written both by relative beginners and by highly advanced scribes. Given the focus on exposing stereotypical fools or embodied vices, it is not surprising that on compilation tablets, Old Man and Young Girl is grouped with other wisdom texts and not with more overtly legal genres. The satirical elements of both stories are targeted at criticizing paradigmatic characters, but never institutions. Although the king may not initially come across as the all-powerful, all-wise, divinely appointed lawgiver and supreme judge, he always regains control and sentences each according to their misdeeds. While our stories do contain intriguingly subversive elements, they always judiciously stop short of any fundamental critique of the existing order. They may point out apparent incidental or conceptual gaps in the law collections, but immediately defend these gaps as justified, because either this resulting scenario would be too absurd, or the characters who would take advantage of them too depraved. Potential subversion is thus contained by hyperbole and humor. The royal vision of an ideal society put forward by the law collections hence remain valid and beyond critique, but measures must be taken to prevent immoral and foolish figures from operating in gray zones not considered by the law. For fixing situations in which law is either unavailable or insufficient, the stories hence propose essentially ethical solutions. Considering the affinity of Three Ox Drivers from Adab and Old Man and Young Girl, with both legal discourse and moralizing wisdom compositions, I would suggest that they are best understood as satirical scribal inventions at the intersection of law and morality. Thank you very much for your attention.